Hello, everyone, and welcome to another day of AP World History. AP World History Modern live streaming lessons. Today, we are wrapping up Unit 8 and finishing our time discussing the Cold War so that we can move on to Unit 9 and learn about the modern global economy before we begin reviewing for the AP World History test. Remember, the AP World History test will cover Units 1 through 6, or the dates 1200 to 1900, and we'll learn more about its format on Friday. A reminder that my name is Chad Smith, and I am here representing my Cardinal Pride. I'm from MacArthur High School, which is a high school in the middle of Dallas, Texas, in a town called Irving. I'm excited to be here with everyone today. Before we get going, let's take a moment to look at our homework from yesterday's assignment. At the end of our lesson yesterday, Mr. Logereau asked us to look at this secondary source by Rudolf Rummel, a United States political scientist, and to respond to 3 different questions, short answer questions, in response to this one claim, or this one excerpt, excuse me. The first question asked us to identify one historical example of mass violence that was committed by a totalitarian state in the 20th century that would support Rummel's argument in the passage. Now, this question has a lot going on in it. And so I would really encourage you, as a matter of fact, I encourage you, no matter how long or short the question is, to always take time to understand the limitations placed on you by a prompt. But in a question this extensive, I would definitely take an extra couple of seconds to make sure you're not just providing an example of mass violence, you're providing an example of mass violence that was committed by a totalitarian state. And it has to support the argument that totalitarian states are relatively easily willing to engage in mass violence. I think the most likely response here would come from the existence of the Nazi Holocaust as an example of a totalitarian state committing mass violence against the Jewish people. Another potential example here would be genocide in Cambodia. The Khmer Rouge was an example of a totalitarian state who committed genocide, which is an example of mass violence. The liquidation of Ukrainian kulaks under Stalin, or basically allowing the Ukrainians to starve to death amidst a massive drought and major starvation, was another example of mass violence committed by a totalitarian state. The Soviet Union was also guilty of it through an event in the late 1930s known as the Great Terror. And there were at least 2 examples of Chinese mass violence, the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. Now, remember, just like every other time we go over AP exam practice here, I'm giving you some answers that could definitely support the claim. Excuse me. I'm giving you some answers that could definitely support the prompt. However, there may be more answers to go along with the prompt. So please reach out to your own AP World History Modern teacher and ask them to help you better understand if you came up with a different response. But before you do that, double check the limitations of the question. Did you give an example of mass violence? And was it violence committed by a totalitarian state or a government with absolute control? Let's look at question B. Question B asks for another example of mass violence, but this time it's important that you're giving an example of mass violence committed by a democratic state. So this mass violence cannot be committed by states that had total control over their people. Instead, there has to be some form of elective bodies in the governments and the states that you're bringing up in response to this question. It also has to support the claim that democracies are less likely to commit mass violence. Excuse me, it has to challenge the claim that democracies are less likely to support mass violence. One obvious example takes us back to the ideas of imperialism that's nicknamed the Scramble for Africa. When Britain and France and other European states who had variations of democratic governments violated those democratic principles that they practiced at home in order to crush African resistance and maintain African colonial states, European colonial states in Africa. Another example is the same concept of imperialism, but the British committing violent atrocities against indigenous populations in Australia in order to create a settlers colony out of Australia. A third example came during World War II when the British initiated the firebombing of Dresden in order to hopefully break the people of Germany and help win World War II. The third question is not asking you for evidence at all. Instead, it's asking you about context. It wants to know what's happened in the world that might give context or help to shape Rummel's viewpoint. What is it that Rummel has experienced that might give him this idea that totalitarian states are more likely to commit mass violence, while democratic states are less likely to commit mass violence? One potential answer to this question is that Rummel's view was shaped by the end of the Cold War. Now, I have to give you a spoiler alert here, but the United States of America, its democratic allies, the ideas of democracy and capitalism come out of the Cold War triumphant. And after the Cold War, the world moves into a global capitalist free enterprise based economy. And part of the reason that the Cold War ended, well, the primary reason the Cold War ended was because communism and totalitarianism as systems in the Soviet Union had proved failures. So the end of the Cold War could absolutely serve as an event that helped to shape Rummel's viewpoint on democracy and mass violence. Another potential answer here is that after World War II, there was a more liberal international world order. One example of this is the creation of the United Nations and the idea that the United Nations would work for international peace and help bring cooperation among states rather than violence and warfare. Of course, the United Nations had members that weren't democratic, but its driving force was democratic principles. And you could think even back to the United Nations Declaration of Rights. A third possible answer here is that the democratic states are less likely to engage in mass violence was shaped by many conservative thinkers who argued after the end of the Cold War that democracy had triumphed. Every state would soon begin to adopt democracy and war between states would end as a result. Again, just like every other time we talk about AP exam practice, there are lots of answers that you could give, excuse me, there are lots of answers that you could give that could be right. And lots of answers that you could give that could be almost right with a short or small tweak. So please take the time to contact your AP World History teacher and learn more from them about possible responses to these questions. But let's go ahead and do a warm-up and talk and get our heads wrapped around the idea of the end of the Cold War. We're going to do our warm-up a little bit differently than we have earlier so far this week and last week. This week, I just want you to read the document and highlight or underline, or you could go to the link in the description, and I have this document there for you already, so you can highlight or underline it. Remember, you can't ask to have access to the documents if you want to manipulate them yourselves, because we can't give individuals access. However, the easiest way to make this document manipulatable is to make a copy for yourself and move that copy into your own drive. If you do that, then you'll be able to manipulate the document yourself. So I want you to read this document. And while you're reading, I want you to do a little bit of guessing. You're going to be looking for clues that the Cold War would end soon. So I'm going to give you about 2 minutes. You can highlight, underline, jot down quotes, whatever it is you need to do. But I want you to read the document and look for clues that the Cold War would end soon. About 30 more seconds to continue reading the document and looking for clues that the Cold War would end soon. Okay. I know you're used to going straight into a review of our warm-up, but I actually want to leave this to the side for now and encourage you as we go through our discussion today of how the Cold War ended. I want you to try to make connections back to this text. And when we're done, we're actually going to go over this text again at the end of our lesson, and we're going to look for examples and specific evidence for the things that President Ronald Reagan talked about in these in much of this text. For now, let's do our lesson overview. Well, I've actually already done this for you. Today, we're going to explain the causes of the end of the Cold War. Our goal at the end of the day is to be able to list several causes and give specific pieces of evidence to support those causes. So let's get right into it. I want to start today by talking about the Cuban Missile Crisis and where we ended our discussion a couple of days ago. The Cuban Missile Crisis, remember, was the time in world history where the world came closest to absolute nuclear war. And the Cuban Missile Crisis is seen by many historians as a major turning point in the Cold War, not because all of the other problems of the Cold War stopped, but because it opened the door to direct communication through what was called the hotline, originally a direct telegraph communication like the one you see here, found in Lyndon Johnson Library in Austin, Texas. This hotline opened the door of communication between the Soviet government and the United States government. It didn't end the Cold War, and it didn't make anything better. As a matter of fact, through the 70s and the 60s, 70s, and 80s, proxy wars continued. And as African and Asian states became independent from their colonial governments and found ways to establish new states, both the Soviet Union and the United States sought to woo those new states into their respective sides, sometimes through direct political control and sometimes through covert interactions. And maybe most significantly, after this turning point and after the communication opening, they still continued in a nuclear arms race. So even though it's a turning point, it's not the end of the Cold War. It's just the beginning of an opportunity for the two sides to talk. However, in the 1970s, the two sides went through a period known as détente. Détente is a French word for relaxation, and it means that the tensions between the Soviet Union and the United States of America began to relax. One of the most significant pieces of evidence for the relaxation between the Soviet Union and the United States of America was that Richard Nixon, the President of the United States, actually visited the Soviet Union. And together, the leader of the Soviet Union and the leaders of the United States of America signed the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, known as the SALT Treaty, which was a massive step forward in limiting the number of nuclear warheads each state, actually limiting the number of intercontinental ballistic missiles each state was willing to maintain. This was a slow thaw in the ideas of nuclear proliferation and the nuclear arms race. Other reasons for the détente in the 1970s were massive economic problems in the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union had a really hard time continuing the growth of the early 50s and even early 60s during the Cold War. As a matter of fact, by the 1970s, the Soviet economy had become stagnant, almost as if a lid was placed on their potential for economic growth. A massive black market grew. People had to wait for hours and hours and hours in line for basic consumer goods like bread or milk. And other consumer goods that was manufactured often came to them faulty or ineffective. The economy of the Soviet Union in the 1970s clearly was no longer working and no longer growing. Another major sign of this was the fact that the Soviet Union didn't have enough grain to keep their people fed. And the people in the Soviet Union were going hungry and starving. In the 1970s, the United States of America sold surplus grain to the Soviet Union in order to help with their starvation problems. There was one more important factor to the tensions decreasing between the Soviet Union and the United States. That was the fact that tensions between the Soviet Union and China, the world's two largest communist states, were increasing. In the 1970s, the Soviets and the Chinese had brief skirmishes over borders. And Richard Nixon was wise to pit the two against each other by also visiting China and helping to build the United States' relationship with China, making the two more interested in a successful, peaceful relationship with the United States than with each other. Despite the fact that actually, let me slow down and give you one more example of detente in the 1970s. When we learned about the Cold War at the very beginning of our live stream lessons, Mr. Logereau talked to us about the space race and told us about how the Soviet Union was at first winning the space race by releasing the world's first satellite into orbit called Sputnik in 1957. In 1975, the United States and the Soviet Union went on their first joint space mission called the Apollo-Soyuz Mission. And here you can see a famous picture called A Handshake in Space, where a United States astronaut is shaking hands with a Soviet cosmonaut, showing the decreased tensions between the Soviet Union and the United States, known as detente. However, in the 1980s and 1979, to be more precise, the tensions between the Soviet Union and the United States of America returned. This started in 1979 when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan to bolster a communist government. This was an extraordinarily costly decision for the Soviet government. The Soviets spent nearly 10 years fighting a war in Afghanistan against guerrilla desert fighters who were eager to demonstrate their strength as a potential military. This not only cost the Soviet Union a ton of money when they needed to focus on the development of their own economy and protect their own people, but it also demonstrated the technological and militaristic weakness of the Soviets. The Soviets were supposed to be one of the two global superpowers, one of the strongest nations in the world. And yet, as they fought this war against guerrilla and militia fighters in Afghanistan, they were failing time after time again, ultimately forced in 1989 to flee from Afghanistan and leave Afghanistan as failures, demonstrating both an economic and militaristic and even moral loss for the Soviet Union. It was early in the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan that Jimmy Carter, a new United States president, cut off sale of the surplus grains to the USSR, making the economic problems in the USSR even more dire. Tensions continued to rise throughout the 1980s. Throughout the 1980s, the United States was offering military support to Afghanistan fighters. And this was particularly offensive to the Soviet Union because in this case, they were offering military support to the direct enemies of the Soviet Union, not like most proxy wars. Take North Korea, for example, where the Americans were supporting the South Koreans and the Soviets were supporting the North Koreans. In this case, the Americans were giving direct military support to Afghanistan fighters who were fighting directly against the Soviet Union. Tension continued to worsen as the president of the United States, Ronald Reagan, constantly referred to the Soviet Union as the evil empire. However, none of these tensions caused quite as much problem as the nuclear reality. See, in 1980, both the Soviet Union and the United States of America had thousands upon thousands of nuclear warheads. They not only had the ability to completely destroy one another, they also had the ability to completely destroy the entire world. To completely destroy the entire world 7 times over. The 1980s were a time of intense fear for nuclear war. But it was in the mid-1980s when the United States President Ronald Reagan announced the Strategic Defense Initiative, sarcastically dubbed Star Wars by many of its critics. The idea of the Strategic Defense Initiative was to make nuclear weapons obsolete and therefore end the policy of MAD, mutually assured destruction, and guarantee American victory over the Soviet Union. The promise of the Strategic Defense Initiative was to build a defense program that would be able to stop Soviet missiles after they were fired, but before they land in their targets. It wasn't clear whether or not such a massive technological undertaking was possible. However, the idea that the United States was prepared to spend millions, even billions of dollars in developing such a concept was an absolute threat to the Soviet Union. In 1985, a reformer came into power in the Soviet Union, and the new leader of the Soviet Union was a man named Mikhail Gorbachev. Mikhail Gorbachev had many reforms in mind to fix the economic and political problems of the Soviet Union. His first major reform was called Perestroika. Perestroika is a word that means restructuring. His goal was to restructure the economy and change it from a full-blown communist system more into a version of socialism that would allow some free market enterprise and still maintain government control over important aspects of the economy. He wanted to welcome in foreign investment. He wanted to end major state regulation over state businesses. He also invited some private businesses, small private businesses known as cooperatives and private farming. This wasn't his only reform. He also wanted a social cultural reform called glasnost. Glasnost meant openness. And the idea of glasnost was to open the Soviet Union and the people of the Soviet Union to new ideas. This government stopped making atheist propaganda and allowed a return to religious life. Churches and mosques across the Soviet Union filled with worshipers as Bibles and the Quran were printed again and made available to people across the Soviet Union. Journalism was introduced to the Soviet Union as state TV was no longer governed by the state, and it exposed both a history of Soviet crimes and current day crime and corruption and abuses that the promise of communism was to stop these things. The promise of communism was to create a system of genuine equality so that these ideas of crime, corruption, and abuses wouldn't have to exist. However, this new journalism in the Soviet Union made it clear that these things existed despite communism, which wasn't working as a moral solution or as an economic solution. They also opened the door to criticism to the government. They opened the door to entertainment in the form of movies, television, and even books. Let's take a moment and discuss the effectiveness of Mikhail Gorbachev's two major reform policies. I want you to take a moment and look at this political cartoon. This political cartoon was created in the Soviet newspaper and published in a Soviet newspaper in 1989. And I want you to think about both glasnost and perestroika. I'll give you about 1.5 to 2 minutes to look at this thing and jot down some ideas, responding to the concept. Let me slow down. Use the document below to evaluate the effectiveness of perestroika or restructuring. And the other question is, use the document below to evaluate the effectiveness of glasnost or openness. Take about 2 minutes. So let's go with the easiest answer here. Actually, I take that back. Let's talk about Perestroika first. What is this political cartoon showing us? Well, this political cartoon is a parody, or it mocks annual parades that the Soviet government used to perform, demonstrating the strength of their military. But instead of seeing tanks rolling down the main road on display for military leaders and the president of the Soviet Union, we see bread trucks, milk trucks, and meat trucks, because these are the items that the consumers of Soviet Union needed. This shows us that the ideas of perestroika and the reforms brought in by perestroika were not very effective in fixing the economy of the Soviet Union. As a matter of fact, the ideas of perestroika were very successful at dismantling the planned economy of the government of the Soviet Union. However, it dismantled that planned government economy without replacing it with a successful market-based economy, further diving the Soviet economy into failure and making it even more difficult for people to get basic needs, as you can see in this political cartoon, like bread, milk, and meat. However, we might say that the very existence of this cartoon is evidence that Glasnost was an extraordinarily successful reform program in the Soviet Union. I mean, before Mikhail Gorbachev, such a cartoon might lead to the death of both the newspaper editors and the people, not just the author, but the newspaper editors and even readers of such a cartoon that exists solely to criticize the government of the Soviet Union. It's because of the openness reforms of Glasnost that such a cartoon could exist in the Soviet Union. Gorbachev had other reforms as well. One important reform for Gorbachev was building a relationship with President of the United States, Ronald Reagan. And together, Gorbachev and Reagan led talks to a new peace treaty that eased nuclear tensions between the two states. This new peace treaty to ease nuclear tensions wasn't just for the people of the Soviet Union and the United States of America, but it helped everyone across the world who was terrified of nuclear warfare between the two states see that there might be a possibility that these two states don't actually end in nuclear war. Gorbachev also ended economic support for Eastern European satellite states. That was extremely important. In the year 1989, the Soviet Union had elections, and in these elections, many communist leaders were ousted from the government, and anti-communist or non-communist parties became a part of a new, real and meaningful Soviet parliament. As the ideas of glasnost and even the ideas of democracy spread through the Soviet Union, many of the satellite states in Eastern Europe began to demand that they had their own democratic systems as well. This is why 1989 is nicknamed the Miracle Year. Many Soviet satellite states had demonstrations and protests, and places like Poland, Ukraine, and even East Germany became independent states from the Soviet Union and ended their totalitarian rule. This didn't end the Soviet Union, however. It continued until 1991, when there was one final communist-based coup against the reforms taking place in government. At the very end of 1991, in December, the Soviet Union finally collapsed. And the collapse of the Soviet Union was unquestionably the end of the Cold War. How could the Cold War exist if one of the two global superpowers no longer existed? Not only was the Cold War over, but it was abundantly clear that the United States, its allies, and the ideas of capitalism and democracy had won the Cold War. And the notion of communism and totalitarianism had become nearly obsolete in the world, as very few states today continue attempts to maintain such economies. Let's take a moment and look back at our opening statement. Once again, this is the speech that President Ronald Reagan gave in June of 1987. I don't remember if I mentioned at the beginning of our lesson today, but he actually gave this speech in Western Berlin. And it was audible in Eastern Berlin as well. In this speech, President Reagan gives many inclinations of the causes of the end of the Cold War that we've talked about today. Let's take a moment to look at some specific quotes and see how President Ronald Reagan references to the stages of the end of the Cold War. In the first paragraph of this excerpt from his speech, he compares the economic success and technological developments of the United States with the technological failures and the economic failures of the Soviet Union. He says, the United States has achieved a level of prosperity and well-being unprecedented in all of human history. But in the communist world, we see a failure, technological backwardness, declining standards of health, and want for even the most basic needs like food. He continues in the second paragraph and he talks about how the Soviets themselves are coming to understand the importance of freedom. This is really important because it alludes to what we now know as 1989, the miracle year. Ronald Reagan was speaking of the importance of Soviet people understanding that freedom was something that they sought out. He even references the specific reform of Perestroika and glasnost by saying the new policy of reform and openness. And he goes on to say that some economic enterprises have been permitted to operate with greater freedom from state control, noting that these reforms produced by the Soviet Union have brought more freedoms to the Soviet Union. In the third paragraph, he mentions the freedom and security go together. The idea that the nuclear factor of the Cold War can only be solved when the two states have freedom and are willing to come to the table and work together. Finally, he ends his speech with one of the most famous phrases in American history, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." And it's 2 years later when the wall comes down. But as you saw in the picture just a few slides ago, it wasn't the Soviet government that tore down the wall. It was massive protests in the name of democracy and freedom. And it was an activist movement of people who tore down the Berlin Wall, tearing down the most enduring symbol of the Cold War, and eventually reuniting Eastern and Western Germany under one state in 1990. Let's take a moment and talk about some AP exam practice. Here I've given you 3 important claims. Each claim is a broad claim about causes of the Cold War. About causes of the end of the Cold War. I want you to go back through the video notes that you've taken as you've listened today, or go back through segments of the video, go through what you've learned from your own teachers, or maybe what you learned from your own research. And I want you to provide evidence for each of the 3 claims shown on the screen. Remember, the easy way is to create a bulleted list of pieces of evidence. But make sure that your evidence clearly supports the claim. The more advanced way is to actually take each one of these claims and make it the topic sentence of a paragraph. If each of these was the first sentence in a paragraph, then the rest of the paragraph would only serve to prove the point made in the first sentence. So instead of making a bulleted list, you could write an actual paragraph, approximately 3 to 4 sentences, providing evidence, specific historical evidence that supports the claim made in your topic sentence. Mr. Laugereau will go over potential responses to these 3 claims tomorrow. Thank you guys so much for watching today. I hope you enjoyed and learned a lot about the end of the Cold War. Tomorrow, we're going to start learning about the new global economy. Have a great day, everybody.